Well, I was sitting at my desk and I was typing on my computer, and I was trying to. So I needed to teach a class, and we talked a little bit about this to students who I was not assuming had any prior exposure to quantum theory, but also complex numbers, linear algebra. I wasn't assuming they'd seen any of these ingredients, but they had seen some probability. And so I felt like I could talk about the theory of stochastic processes. So let me give a little bit of historical background that I don't think we've talked about before.
Please.
So when I was in college, I spent a summer at Fermilab, which is an experimental physics laboratory in the United States, in Illinois. I learned a couple of important things from this experience. One was how to drive on highways, because there were a lot of highways. Like, we would pull out of where we were sleeping, the place, the rental places where we were all staying. You'd pull right out onto a 4-lane highway.
Okay.
So it was a real chance to get a lot of driving experience. That was one thing I learned. Another thing was the sky is really huge in Illinois. Like, as someone who spent a lot of my time growing up in New York City and then in the suburbs of New York City with lots of trees, you don't see a lot of the sky all the time.
Right.
And where we were staying in Illinois, the sky was enormous. That was a really extraordinary thing. I also learned that I was not destined to be an experimental particle physicist. So that was an important thing to learn.
Because?
Wasn't particularly good with my hands. Ultimately, I think I never managed to use a soldering iron. But, I would go to meetings and we'd talk about getting the experiments, what was the latest going with experiments. And it just wasn't what I felt most interested in. I had enormous respect for the people who did that work. It was incredibly interesting. And what they were able to make matter and energy do was extraordinary. It just I just didn't have the right connection to it. I found myself thinking a lot more about theoretical and philosophical questions. So I learned that also. And the other thing was I decided to learn linear algebra. I wanted to get ahead. And so I found a curriculum that was being taught at my college curriculum. And I saw the book they were using. I found some homework exercises. And I had a summer and I was away at Fermilab. So I decided to spend the evenings learning linear algebra. When I finished doing all the homeworks, I went to a professor, Dave Byer, really nice guy, really amazing guy, mathematician. And I told him I had done all this work and I was wondering if he would grade it for me, if I could get some kind of letter grade. I figured after all this work, maybe I can get a letter grade and put it on my transcript. He said, okay, but only if I did a final exam, a take-home exam. I said, okay. So he gave me a take-home exam, and I did the exam, and I did okay. I did okay on the exam, but when he sent it back to me, I was a little bit disappointed in my final grade, and I felt a little bad because I put so much work into the course. And so I asked him, okay, so I got this final grade, that's fine, but I'm wondering, is there anything I can do to boost the grade? Could I do like an extra project or something like that? And he says, actually, yeah, you could do an extra project if you want maybe to boost your grade. This project is on stochastic processes. I had never heard of stochastic processes before. Back in high school, I had played around with probabilistic simulations for various things, but I'd never done anything like a formal study of probabilistic theories. So this was my first opportunity to see this. And I think what's interesting about this is if I had done better on this exam, I never would have had this encounter, right? So, this is, I think, a general lesson. Sometimes you have an experience and you feel like it's bad news. And it turns out actually it might be really good news. Here I'm quoting Kurt Vonnegut. And for those of you who don't know, Kurt Vonnegut has this famous lecture he used to give on good news and bad news. And we never know what the good news or bad news is at the time. Sometimes we only find out the answer much later. And he's got a lecture on YouTube people can go watch. It's a very interesting lecture. So at the time, I thought it was very bad news that I hadn't done so well in this exam. In the end, it gave me an opportunity to learn the rudiments of the subject. And this is an old story. I mean, Max Born tells a story in his autobiographical memoir about when Heisenberg was visiting from Munich to Göttingen with Max Born, and Heisenberg eventually defended his doctoral dissertation, and he was asked a question that he couldn't answer. This is Born retelling the story. It's in My Life: Recollections of Nobel Laureate, which is Max Born's autobiographical memoir, and he tells the story about how Heisenberg could not get this one question. It was proposed to him by Wilhelm Wien, who was an experimental physicist. And Wien was quite upset that Heisenberg couldn't get the answer and wanted to fail him. And his other two committee members said that they couldn't fail him. He was the best theorist they'd ever seen. And so they agreed to give him the lowest passing grade. And Heisenberg was just mortified. He felt so depressed after he got this. He barely passed this, his final exam for his doctoral work. And he went and he sort of sulked for a long time. But then he thought about this question that Wilhelm Wien had asked him. And it turned out the question was closely related to the uncertainty principle. And so all this time he spent worrying about this question he couldn't answer may have helped inspire him to come up with the principle that is the most famous thing attached to Heisenberg.
Interesting.
The Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So again, you never know whether something you think is a failure is ultimately going to end up being the thing that is important for your career. So I learned about stochastic matrices in a very rudimentary way. I considered some very simple stochastic systems that I was given to do for this final project. I learned about their connection, long-time behavior of stochastic processes and how this is related to their eigenvalues. But these were all very new terms to me because I had only just learned linear algebra that summer. Fast forward a number of years to the end of my doctoral dissertation, in which I'm writing simulations, numerical simulations, to handle these intricate systems of black holes that show up in certain low-energy solutions to quantum gravity. And to model them, we ended up having to use Markov chain Monte Carlo simulations. And so I was revisiting this theory of stochastic processes, and I was remembering all the stuff I had done way back in, early on when I was in college that summer.
How many years at this point is there in between?
Something like 8 years, 9 years, something like that.
Okay.
I mean, I have to be more precise. I don't know exactly when I started doing the numerical simulation, so it's a little hard to say.
So how much of it did you recall? Is it just a semblance, like the gist of it, or are you recalling precise formulas?
I remembered the gist of it, but I had scanned, I'd Xeroxed, I'd photocopied all my notes. And so I went looking for my old notes for this project that I did. And so I had an opportunity to see it again.
Interesting.
But now this is so many years later. It's after I had done an undergraduate degree in physics and math. It's after I had studied a lot of theoretical physics and philosophy. It's the end of graduate school. I mean, I was coming at it from a completely different vantage point. And it looked very rudimentary to me now, given, all the work that I had done in the years since. But I was so fascinated by this. Because going back to that time, I saw these stochastic matrices, this sort of theory of stochastic processes, before I had learned quantum mechanics, before I really knew anything concrete about quantum mechanics. And seeing it again, after all these years of having thought about, having taught quantum mechanics to students as a teaching assistant, having taken so many more quantum mechanics courses, having used quantum mechanics so much in all of my other work, I was struck by some of the formal similarities between the theory of stochastic processes and quantum theory. These are both theories that involve probabilities. They're both theories that involve processes in which the outcomes are indeterministic and are described using some kind of probability. They're both theories in which we encode those probabilities in vectors, in vector spaces. Stochastic processes, it's probability vectors. Quantum theory, it's state vectors or wave functions, or somewhat more generally density matrices. Time evolution is given by square matrices. For a stochastic process, they're stochastic matrices. These are matrices whose entries are non-negative and the columns sum to 1. If we think about multiplication as being multiplication where the matrix is on the left and the probability vector is on the right. And in quantum theory, it's unitary matrices, unitary operators that carry out the evolution. For the theory of stochastic processes, some of the things we might want to ask about are random variables, functions on a sample space. The random variables are the things we could observe. They're the observables. And in quantum theory, observables are represented by operators or matrices, self-adjoint operators or matrices. We call them observables also. So there are all these formal resemblances. And so now fast forward to me trying to prepare for this class, trying to teach to students who, like me, didn't know linear algebra, at the time, didn't know, very much about complex numbers, didn't know about quantum theory, but knew something about probability. And I thought, well, maybe I can adjust the formalism of the classical theory of stochastic processes, and maybe I can adjust the formalism of quantum theory to make them look a little more similar. Maybe I can figure out some kind of mapping between them or change how I write them to make them look more similar. And I was the goal was very clear. My goal was to bring the two theories as close together as possible, and then be able to tell the students, okay, students, here's what you need to jump the gap. And by bringing the two theories close together, the hope was that I could make that gap a little bit less mysterious, a little bit less arcane, a little bit less extravagant. Maybe I could boil it down to some relatively simple, transparent change. Maybe a generalization, maybe dropping an assumption, maybe modifying an assumption. Something simpler than just listing all the Dirac-von Neumann axioms out of the blue like we often do. And the surprising thing was that the gap disappeared. And suddenly I had one mathematical formalism for both the theory of stochastic processes and for quantum theory. And I was very confused how this had happened. It took me a little while to realize that I had implicitly given up the Markov assumption, the assumption that for the stochastic process, what comes next according to the process is determined solely by the system's present state or configuration. That's the Markov assumption. I had allowed the probabilistic development of the system to depend on past details that were not mediated solely by what was going on at the present. And once I realized I had dropped this, immediately what I did was check the literature and see, surely someone else has tried to model quantum theory using a non-Markovian stochastic process of some kind. And the answer was there was almost nothing in the literature about this. Previous efforts to replace quantum theory with something like a stochastic theory, which go back to the work of Fritz Bopp in the 1940s, who, by the way, is mentioned in Hugh Everett's correspondences, his 1957 letter to Bryce DeWitt, his extended unpublished dissertation from 1956. He talks about Bopp's stochastic theory, says actually he thinks it's a fine theory if it can be fully developed. His objection is not to indeterminism. He doesn't prefer determinism over indeterminism. Everett says he just wants a theory that does one thing and not the Dirac-von Neumann axioms, which seem to be deterministic in some situations and indeterministic in others. He's very clear about this, and I recommend, and you can put a link to his full 137-page unpublished dissertation. It's available online. People can read about this.
The link will be on screen.
So this will be an interesting thing for people to look at. But then work by Imre Fenyez in the 50s and Edward Nelson in the 60s through the 80s. But they had assumed that the dynamics should be Markov. This Markov assumption was an ingrained assumption that many people had. Now, at least as far back as 2011, here I'm pointing to some work by Shelley Goldstein, Tosk, Norson, and Zangi. They have an article in Scholarpedia on Bell's theorem, which you can also link to. They note that Bell implicitly assumed Markovianity in deriving his theorem. There's a much more recent draft article by Tim Maudlin called The Great Rift in Physics, Relativity and Quantum Theory, in which he also highlights this Markovian assumption that's implicitly made in Bell's theorem. This is especially clear in the 1990 formulation of Bell's theorem. La Nouvelle Cuisine is the name of that paper. You can link to that as well. Bell relies crucially on situating his so-called screening local beables in a space-time region of finite thickness. It has to be finite thickness so it doesn't intrude on the light cone of the other thing. And if you have a non-Markovian set of laws, you can jump over those regions through the laws, but in a manner that stays within the light cones, respects light cone structure, so provides a way around some of Bell's conclusions while respecting the so-called relativistic causal structure of spacetime. But what I think was lacking was a concrete realization of this loophole. Loophole may not be quite the right word, because Bell has premises. Some of them were explicit, some of them were implicit. Those premises lead to Bell's theorem. Here we're denying one of the premises. That's not quite a loophole as much as showing the theorem is doing its job, right? The theorem says with these premises, you get this result, and I'm denying one of those premises. So that doesn't mean the theorem is broken. In fact, it's showing the theorem is doing its job as a no-go theorem, highlighting what the premises are, although arguably by not making this Markov assumption explicit, there was a loop, but you could argue that's a loophole in some sense. But what we lacked was a concrete realization of a comprehensive formulation of quantum theory that was built on non-Markovian laws. And I had inadvertently stumbled into such a theory.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're hungry for deeper dives into physics, AI, consciousness, philosophy, along with my personal reflections, you'll find it all on my Substack. Subscribers get first access to new episodes, new posts as well, behind-the-scenes insights, and the chance to be a part of a thriving community of like-minded pilgrimers. By joining, you'll directly be supporting my work and helping keep these conversations at the cutting edge. So click the link on screen here, hit subscribe, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge together. Thank you and enjoy the show. Just so you know, if you're listening, it's CURTJAIMUNGAL.org, kurtjaimungal.org.